This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. This is the Friday Lunch Show with Morgan Whitfield and Todd Brennan. Today, we will be discussing AI and vocabulary with our special guest, Jake Cowling from the Australia International School. We look forward to a great discussion. Please feel free to join it by texting in. Looking forward to a great discussion.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. I am extremely excited to welcome everyone to our Friday lunch show today. Todd and I have been out for a few weeks, so we are really excited to have a really wonderful discussion with Jake Cowling today on the topic of vocabulary and AI. So what I'm going to do is just see, Jake, are you here with us today?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, and I am so excited to speak with you. Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio, and welcome to the Friday show.
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm excited to have a little chat.
Yeah, just so everyone knows a little bit about you, Jake is a primary educator, and he is speaking at many an education conference. He's an advocate for cognitive science and empowering teachers with AI to streamline planning and resourcing, which is why we are delighted to have him on. He's currently teaching at the Australian International School in Sharjah. He holds a Bachelor of Education and specializes in explicit instruction grounded in the latest cognitive science. He has a commitment to evidence-informed educational practices and is constantly up to date. He is prominent and amazing at every single educational conference that you can imagine, including Research Ed, and he's an incredible advocate for effective and efficient teaching practices. Jake, I am delighted because I have a feeling that you are going to streamline and make my life so much easier, because so much of what I teach as a geographer has to do with vocabulary. And I always feel like I am teaching a new language to my students in every single topic that I teach, and understanding how to do that and do that elegantly and well. It seems to be, it's such a gift to be able to pass that on. So I'm really looking forward to you sharing all your secrets.
Absolutely not a problem. Happy to share. As for secrets, well, you're a geographer teacher. Well, geography, it's got all that tier 3 vocabulary, right? So look, in terms of attacking that, my background in vocabulary, it stems back probably a couple of years when I got into this sort of niche of vocabulary, and it was sort of like a low-hanging fruit, you know, for all of us as teachers. You know, teaching words, gets that reading comprehension up there. So I thought to myself, why not, do some research into what is effective practice when teaching words. And I got into a little bit of a niche. There's many different ways to teach vocabulary, but in geography, those tier 3 words come to mind, don't they?
Can you take us right to the beginning? Jake, why don't you just kind of simply break down, when we look at tiers of words, what does that mean?
Well, yeah, for those who are not familiar, tiered vocabulary is essentially, you've got 3 tiers, and you've got tier 1 vocabulary, which is words that are spoken in everyday oral language. Tier 2 being words spoken in words mostly used in written text, but not so much in oral language, so when we speak. But then tier 3 is that subject-specific vocabulary where you might see in geography. So look, using that as a little bit of a mental model, knowing which words to teach as tier 1 vocabulary most likely can be achieved incidentally through rich oral language experiences. It doesn't really need to be plucked out and taught explicitly, where essentially that's my focus when it comes to vocabulary, explicit vocabulary instruction with the help of AI.
So, can you take me on a little bit of a journey? Why do you feel like this is so important, and how did you kind of come to this place where AI, at the junction of AI, this has become kind of an incredible tool for us to teach more complex and really valuable disciplinary vocabulary?
So my journey started with researching good explicit instructional routines for vocabulary. And what came to mind that AI can do well is that, well, it can give definitions of words quite easily. I think it's really hard for AI to really muck that up in a sense. So I thought about all the different types of vocabulary acquisition and explicitly teaching just the word itself. Thought it was the most achievable to use with AI. I think that there are other types of vocabulary instruction that are very important that all teachers should use in their classroom. So, morphology instruction, so morphemic analysis, contextual analysis, so reading around the word to sort of derive meaning of the unknown word. Incidentally, teaching words as well comes to mind, but explicit vocabulary instruction sort of sprung to mind, and I sort of had this little epiphany of thinking, okay, well then I think there's an opportunity for AI to get involved here to sort of streamline some resources for myself. And I sort of went down this sort of journey of learning to sort of code, or AI sort of teaching me how to code and coming up with ways of how to sort of coming up with really efficient ways to build these resources. However, it wouldn't be possible without the knowledge or the understanding of what makes a good resource or what makes good vocabulary instruction when teaching it explicitly. So it was a little bit of half-half, So half, reading those books to find out about what is effective vocabulary instruction, but then the other half was dabbling into the AI world and finding out what worked best for this sort of resource creation, right? So that's sort of how it came to be and how my journey sort of started.
It's really interesting because I find it really fascinating because of the context that I teach in. So the fact that I have so many speakers who speak many, many different languages, who have many diverse needs. When we think about explicit vocabulary instruction, it's more than just kind of giving the definition of a word. We explicitly explain the meaning of a word. We can use definitions, but often it means we are using examples. We are using visuals. We're using new context. We're allowing students to explore that in different sentences, to use them in narratives. We have them play with it both orally and in the written form. We have them use oracy. How do we kind of, when we think about explicit vocabulary instruction, what are the fundamentals that we have to have an understanding of first before we then play around and then maybe create better resources with AI? I find that sometimes I dive in with AI and not necessarily create something that's good, but something that keeps kids busy. How do I know that I have my fundamentals right?
Yeah, I think, Morgan, you really elaborated really well what explicit vocabulary is. Yeah, using those examples with the non-examples and going in, sort of throwing the word up into the air and attacking it with different contexts, right? So those students have a deep, nuanced understanding. But I actually like to think of AI helping us with the surface level general context of the word. But then where the richness of the word comes from is actually where you're getting the word itself. So most of the time, I'm thinking about geography lessons, but maybe English lessons for myself, the word where the richness comes from is from the novel that I'm getting it from, right? And so you always want to return to the context from where that word is being taught from. So I think when I think of AI, yes, it can be helpful in that regard, that it can sort of think of all those different contexts in ways that you wouldn't think that off the top of your head per se when thinking about that particular word that you need to teach. But then throwing it back into the context itself of where you've got that word from, I feel like that's the richness, right? And that's the where the students will be able to use that deep, nuanced understanding, because you've taken it out of context from the book. You've used that the AI generated context. Oh, yeah, context one, for example, and an adjective describing a person, place, thing, an idea, whereas in the book it's only describing a person, right? And so you've been able to use AI to being able to use that adjective, how it describes a person, place, or thing or idea, and then you're returning back to the book and seeing how it's describing a person, but also thinking about those other ways that adjective was used, right, in those other contexts. And I feel like those students really get a really good benefit from hearing it and seeing it and saying it, and exploring it in a variety of ways by using AI. Does that make sense there, Morgan? I feel like I've rambled on a little bit there.
No, that makes complete sense. I think that language is one of those things that we naturally want to be playful with.
Mm,
I think it's one of the reasons that kids, when they're young, they actually enjoy the complexity of words. They enjoy using big words incorrectly and then seeing if they get it right, giving you that look.
right.
I think that we're naturally playful with language. And when students have the opportunity to explore it with AI, they have several different ways or vehicles of entering a word, I guess, to
Hmm.
understand it. And I think that there's also this psychological safety that this tool can give us when we're looking at playing with words. When I look at teaching language, I find that a lot of the times before I enter a new unit, what I do is I go in having
Mm,
given students kind of a vocabulary that they are going to be building up. So here's a vocabulary list that is going to be really, really
right.
useful that you will have on hand before we even enter the topic. And these aren't just keywords. These words are the ones that will allow you to actually talk about rivers, or they're going to be able to allow you to understand tectonic plates. Like even the
Right.
word tectonic itself, that is some of that tier 3 vocabulary. So I think like there's huge concepts that go behind these words, and we just have to get students familiar with them first and then playing with them. Can you
Mm,
take me through maybe a few examples of words that you have kind of set on fire for students? So all of a sudden the journey that a student goes on when they are introduced to a new complex word that helps unpack an entire kind of schema of learning. I think of the word tectonic all the time when I
right.
I think of the word tectonic all the time when I think of this, because there's so much conceptually that goes underneath that word, literally and metaphorically.
Oh, that's such a hard question to answer, Morgan. Like, I can think off the top of my yeah, which word? Well, the one I usually generally use in my examples in like when I speak at Research Ed was well, there was one where I would say, okay, teaching the word abrupt to my class was one, for example, and knowing that something happens suddenly but without warning, and being able to go into depth with that word, and then the students eventually just using it. Within the classroom without prompting, I found to be quite, insightful towards like, oh, hang on, I might be doing the right thing here if you're teaching it in the right way. But yeah, the word abrupt happening suddenly without warning, as I said, using it in different examples where perhaps the words describe what's an adjective describing a person, how a person can be abrupt, and therefore that person's a little bit rude, right? But then the bus stopped. So a thing, stopping abruptly. Oh, okay. Happens suddenly without warning. What's the effect of that? Oh, yeah, people fall over or, might hurt themselves. The mountain cliff or the place. So the mountain cliff had an abrupt edge. So sort of talking about the nuance there. So you can sort of see how, like, just taking that time, even though you think to yourself, okay, well, it's just one word. How much are they going to be using it? Well, going into that depth it really creates that really deep meaning for them to be able to cling on to it and use previous experiences or previous knowledge to sort of attach meaning to it, so it does stick, right? But yeah, I feel like maybe that's an example I can give to you there, Morgan, in terms of how the students would hear it in different contexts, but then apply it in themselves. And then, I think it was one time when one of the students, or I think it was one of the teachers that left the classroom, the door made a loud sound. One of the students came, "Oh, that was quite abrupt, wasn't it, Mr. Jake?" And I was like, "Oh, yes, exactly. It was abrupt." How did you? Yeah. And so I love those little moments, right? And like, there's been other moments where, teaching the word immaculate, the kids would say, "Oh, Mr. Jake, look how immaculate my desk is," and, after asking them to clean their desk. Just little moments like that. I was like, yes, that's good. These tier 2 words are sort of coming to life, and they're using them a little bit more. Great little stories there.
That's so wonderful. It is incredible when you see kids play with language like that, and they do take such pride when they are trying out a new word, and they can feel that they've like articulated themselves so perfectly. It's incredibly powerful. It's like having the more words you have, it's like more and more tools in your arsenal. So speaking of abrupt entrances, Todd, are you able to join us now?
I hope so. Can you finally hear me?
Lovely. We can hear you. I feel like I've been hogging Jake asking questions. Todd will be able to add so much to this conversation because Todd is not only a wordsmith, he's an English teacher. So I always think that I love words, but then after a discussion with Todd, I find out I only like them medium.
No, it's really good to have Jake on, because I do think this is really important, not just for English teachers, but for teachers of all subject areas. And Jake, I think I don't think it's an overstatement on my part to say that I've found your LinkedIn one of the most interesting in recent times. The post that you've been making about vocabulary, its importance and your approach to it, and also how you've been utilizing artificial intelligence to kind of make really bespoke things for your students. I think it's been really, really interesting, and I'm really excited to share that with people today. Obviously, I've missed the first part, so I don't know if a recap's a useful thing for everyone here, but I'll pick it up, I'm sure.
Well, thanks, Todd. Thanks for the compliment there, mate. Look, the whole LinkedIn scenario has been amazing, really. It's great to be able to just connect with yourself. I don't think without LinkedIn I wouldn't be talking to you both. So, it's quite a far-reaching audience, right?
Definitely.
I think that the number one question that we had for you actually has to do with basically how we can reduce teacher workload when we're planning for vocabulary instruction. So I thought what we'd do is we would take a short little break, and then we would come back to that, because I feel like that is almost at the heart of what I hinted at the very start of the show, that I want you to share the secrets. How to make the planning easier. So we'll just have a word from our sponsors and we'll be right back.
Sure.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded program helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit AxiomMaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering math circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out! Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit AxiomMaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering math circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out! Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
And welcome back. Thank you for joining us. We are with Jake Cowling and we are looking at vocabulary and AI. And right before our ad break, we were looking at how we can reduce workload for teachers and make it simple, easy, and really efficient to create resources that aid in making vocabulary come to life for our students. And AI gives us those many different vehicles to do so. So, Jake, why don't you take us away with some of the work that you have been doing?
I've been working on prompt engineering, essentially. So elaborate, paragraphs of text that are, there's a bit of an investment phase when writing a prompt for AI, but it's taken some time, but also some research as well. I've taken lots of great ideas from Bringing Words to Life, Isabella Beck and McEwen. Are you familiar with that text, Morgan?
Yes, great book. Yes.
Yeah, great. So I took their instructional activities and paraphrased them a little bit into a prompt, and their set of instructional activities, I think it was brought to 10. And then from those 10 instructional activities, I've gone and just gone on some hybrid activities from some other resources as well. So that was my anchor, that Bringing Words to Life, but then also Anita Archer's Explicit vocabulary instruction, took her instructional routine and sort of placed that within the prompt as well. So I've actually got a prompt, a GPT that essentially any teacher could use. It's free, and they can write down, they don't have to write down a sentence and explain to the AI exactly what they want, but they can just write down the word. They just have to write down the word. Perhaps it's part of speech, particular pertaining to what context it's in. So like I was saying before, abrupt, they can put the word abrupt in, and it was an adjective. Okay, press enter, and it will come up with a set of instructional activities for that teacher. So I've gone ahead and done the work in terms of prompt engineering. But for teachers to do that themselves, it takes a bit of work. And it takes a bit of work in terms of having to read the books. But not all teachers have to reinvent the wheels. I've gone ahead and taken some other prompts from other teachers for other domains and found great success as well. Because what I've engineered basically is wanting it to be intuitive enough for a teacher just to pick up and say, "Oh yeah, that's okay. I can sort of explain the word that way, and I can." Have this check for understanding question. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay, that's a multi-choice question. Yeah, I can put that into my whatever slide deck or write that up on the board, however you want to present it, right? So that's what I've gone and done. And I guess I've put it on steroids a little bit. I've gone ahead and made a bank of free Google Slides as well. So teachers can pick up there's an academic word list that teachers can use. They can pick up, okay, this is an academic word that I need to teach, and they can use that slide deck resource as well. And I've just put the pictures in, and everything essentially is there ready to go with all the animations. So that's essentially my work and what I've been doing. But what teachers can do as well is use that prompt from the AI tool, the GPT, and just simply write in the word, and it'll spit out instructional activities ready to go. It's as simple as that.
What does a great instructional activity look like? So if I was to go back pedagogically thinking, well, what's the type of activity that would stretch my students? How would I ensure that I'm putting in a prompt that's really great? And that I'm again, if you are creating these so that there are resources that are ready to go, how do you know that they're really good ones? How do I know that I can create something that will be consistently good?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that to be an effective instructional activity, we also need to think about time. Time is a huge factor. And if we're just teaching one word, well, you've got to think about how quick it's got to be, because there's many other things that we need to be teaching in that lesson. It's not just one word. So we can't be just stretching out an instructional activity for 10 minutes for 3 words. It's got to be quick, sharp, and to the point, and it's got to be exact. So you would have maybe a basic instructional routine for teaching the word that should maybe take about 2 minutes, and then you're straight into the instructional activities and checking for understanding. So ones that I've used in my bank of resources is really simple ones that are quick, short, sharp, and where the instructional activity takes place, it's a lot of turn and talk and collaborative discussion between the students. And I wanted that because, considering my context and yours as well, Morgan, students are English language learners, and so oral language is very important for them to be using the word, saying the word, and using it in with their own sentences and their own prior knowledge. So first instructional activity off the cab off the rank, I would say, all right, boys and girls, if I say something that reminds you of target word, say target word. If not, don't say anything. And then I would just say a sentence, or I'd get the students to say the sentence with the target word included. And then after the sentence is finished, the students either say target word if they think that the sentence relates to the target word, and if it doesn't, they don't say anything. So you could imagine how quick that instructional activity takes, right? 15 seconds to say the sentence, 5 seconds of thinking time, 2 seconds of giving an answer, and about 3 seconds of you checking around the room for more than 80% correct, or hearing majority of the students in that case correct. Then you're moving on to the next instructional activity. So that would be one. Another activity.
Good pace. Like that is I think that's the thing too. When it comes to like teaching vocabulary, I think you want that pace too, because if you do labor on a word too long, then you kind of lose the freshness. And I think you want to constantly then revisit later on. So there's less retrieval.
Absolutely. Like, yeah, otherwise it's got to be a perky pace. Otherwise, I think it's quite monotonous vocabulary teaching. So you want to be quickly going through it, not too quick, but at a perky pace to the point where you return back to that story context or whatever context where that word lies. So whether it's in your lesson, your geography lesson, or, the novel that you're reading with your students, you want to go back to that context and bring meaning, because essentially what you're trying to do, yes, you're trying to have long-term storage retrieval of that word, but also build comprehension of what you're teaching when teaching those new words. So,
It's
yeah.
that's exactly what I was going to ask you. My next question for you is exactly that, on contextualized vocabulary use. So how can AI help teachers embed vocabulary that is authentic, subject rich? The context is there rather than the word just kind of being there in isolation.
Mm, mm. So I would say, yes, teach it in isolation, but then go back to the context. The way that the students are going to see that rich context is within the variety of lessons. Okay, lesson 1 on tectonic plates is going to be talking about this particular place, but then lesson 2, they might see the word tectonic in another context as well. So I feel like, for myself, this is just subjectively speaking, the richness comes from the lesson of where the word lies. But you're teaching it in isolation, and if you're going to teach richness in isolation, it's going to take too long. And it doesn't pertain. If it's going to pertain to the lesson itself, well, then you're teaching 2 lessons, aren't you? Because you're spending a lot of time within the vocabulary lesson itself, and then also the main lesson itself, where the vocabulary word is. So I think, to ourselves as teachers, I think the richness. Okay, I think AI is great. Teach it in isolation. I feel like it's sort of got this sort of ghost, or there's some sort of bad rap for teaching in isolation. I think it's not too bad as long as you're quickly returning to that rich context. I don't see a problem at all. And I've seen success where students have been able to bring that, seeing it in isolation in maybe a little different context, and then bringing that back in that schema of knowledge, because you've brought it out of context, you've lowered the cognitive load. There's not a million other things I need to think about. It's just the word itself within a small context, using it in a different context where it is from the lesson. And also you've used student-friendly language, particularly for my students, grade 5 English language learners. They need the context around it needs simple language for them to, connect that prior knowledge to that word. So I think that's quite important too. I forgot what the question was, but yeah. So going back to richness of the richness of the word comes from the lesson, and teaching in isolation is where AI comes to play. But you're doing it quick, perky pace, and then returning back to the lesson where the word lies.
I think as well, in doing so, you're removing that. As experts or as proficient users of the language, we forget, what the limitations of a word are as well. So, when you're doing things there like using examples and in essence sharing non-examples as well, with your earlier example, your 15 seconds, you're giving students a chance to see that native style understanding of those words. You mentioned there tectonic's a great example, because we'd use that metaphorically as well as geographically and scientifically, wouldn't we?
Right.
And yet that's not an immediately obvious usage of the word.
No.
And it's a fantastic word to teach because it will come up in a number of contexts, but probably not in the everyday language of most students, and certainly not English as an additional language students.
Yeah.
No, I think that's really fantastic. I find personally, because of that expert bias, coming up with non-examples is far, far harder than coming up with student-friendly definitions or anything else.
Hard. Yeah, absolutely.
So if AI can support just with that one area of non-examples, and just to circle back, you may need to go back to how to use a GPT in that regard. For the people who, when they first got Googled flights to Spain.com, you may need to give us a Luddite-friendly version in a moment. But I think just that one use there of the non-examples is such a benefit for so many teachers.
Definitely.
I find that so great, especially when you're trying to do like multiple choice diagnostic questions. I find can be really tricky, but they are fantastic at flushing out students' misconceptions. And what's fantastic about using AI is that it's really good at getting non-examples for a multiple choice question. So creating those really, really great non-examples, which I would tend to struggle with as a teacher, having that created for me really, really quickly, that is such a godsend. It does save me reams of time, especially because there's some language, especially within my own subject domain, which always sounds the same but is slightly different. Is like there are different types of, let's say, abrasion and attrition, for instance, that I always have students mess up, and I know these misconceptions are coming. So having multiple choice questions or having questions that allow me to find easy non-examples, those are fantastic. And you're right, non-examples are difficult. They're harder for students to come up with too, which is a challenge in itself.
Yeah, well, it's taken me a long time to sort of get it right with AI, and still I can't guarantee that it will. But what in essence makes a good non-example is that it's minimally different from the example itself. So you give a good example. I've got one here in front of me for the word monotonous, right?
Oh, good.
Monotonous meaning boring and repetitive. And so I would give an example. Okay, the roller coaster was monotonous, although it had many exciting loops. So this is a not example of monotonous, because exciting loops on a roller coaster would be the opposite of something that is dull and repetitive. So you're sort of having to think about, okay, the definition itself, it has critical attributes. So the critical attributes being boring, and then also the other critical attribute of monotonous is being repetitive. And so you've got to think of being in the mind of a child. They're seeing this word for the first time. They may have never heard it before. They can really have some misconceptions that you would never think of. So perhaps monotonous, they would say boring and repetitive. They might think, oh, okay, a roller coaster might be boring because it's repetitive. Oh, yeah, it's monotonous. Oh, however, there's another part of that. You need to have both critical attributes to make that definition of that word. So it needs to be boring as well. So therefore, a roller coaster can't be monotonous because it's exciting. But it is repetitive because there might be loop, loop, loop in the roller coaster. So yeah, it's kind of tricky in building those non-examples and really having to think carefully and thinking about, okay, how would maybe perhaps that student see that word for the first time with their prior understanding and knowledge? It's quite interesting.
That's
Definitely,
really interesting. I think
definitely.
monotonous is a great example. Roller coaster is a great non-example.
Yeah, I always used to use naive when trying to explain this to people, and I'd say he didn't bring his rain jacket out on a summer's day in England. Is that naive? And of course, then students have got like something to debate there with that word. But I like that one. That's really good. Monotonous. It's very, very clear. And the other thing that I find students find challenging, I don't know if what you've done, Jake, addresses this, but is connotations of a word. So certain words. Is reminisce does it have negative connotations? Generally speaking, that's the sort of questions that students ask you, right? When you're introducing a new word, is nostalgia negative? No, nostalgia is amazing. Well, it actually means the pain of not being able to go backwards. The literal etymology of the word is what the root words add up together.
Absolutely.
And if you look at it in context, that is pretty much how we use it. We use it with that undercurrent of pain, and yet the connotations aren't often of that. So have you found it useful in that regard of sort of thinking carefully about the connotations of words and how to teach students to use them accurately for
Connotations, I think, are beyond my realm in terms of using AI to sort of build that, although it can give you some good examples. But we're talking about semantics, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so like the semantics, it's kind of tricky because you can have different semantics based on students' beliefs and values, right? So I'll give you an example. Like you could come into a classroom and say, "Oh, it's hot in here, isn't it?" And the phrase, "Oh, it's hot in here," could mean that turn on the air conditioner, right? So words can have so many different connotations, positive, negative, not only positive and negative, but also different meanings altogether, right? So that's something that's I would say it's beyond the scope of AI. Although in terms, I would say, Todd, I haven't dabbled into it too much, but that is a really good question in terms of positive and negative connotations of words. Something that I have sort of done would say is like use, I think it's Tim Rosinski, his name is, he used vocabulary ladders. And we're using like, it's like a sort of the nuance of the words and difference of the words and negative and positive connotations. I'm trying to find an example here on my screen. But you would have like a vocabulary cline going from least to most, and then ordering words of how they are. So least happy to most happy, and have a variety of words for example, excited, just to give one example. But yeah, connotations of words. Yeah, I would say I haven't dabbled into it too much.
No, it's fine. It's just an interesting one. It's a sticky one that I know, teachers who do drive at vocabulary instruction, and vocabulary instruction is so important because essentially words are what we think with. But that particular area is really thorny. It was actually part of my lesson this week is reminisce positive or is it negative?
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a simple answer rather than just seeing the word lots and lots in context. And perhaps that's where the decontextualized can lose its power a little bit. Whereas
Yeah.
maybe the example you gave and the naive example I gave, for those who know anything about UK weather, would know that it is fairly naive to not bring a raincoat out on a summer's day. So maybe it's those things where students accrue knowledge about connotations rather than us directly instructing in those particular areas. But I just wondered if you'd found anything useful with it, because it is a thorny issue.
Yeah,
I
I
think
would say, yeah. Sorry, Morgan.
Oh, yeah, I was just thinking, those are, when you think about something like the example of reminiscing being a good or bad thing, words as an action itself means that you are asking a student to take a pro or a con. And so there is kind of there's a lot of oracy involved in discussing how you unpick that word. And then you always are kind of, each student is coming with their constructed world of what that word reminisce means to them and whether reminiscing to them might be good or bad. So the power of asking them to debate a word with such intensity actually can bring up quite a lot, because it is their lived experience that they would be bringing into that conversation, which is what makes it so rich and why the meaning is then very much enhanced by their own experience. So I really like the idea of students playing with words in that way and imbuing it with new meaning. I think a lot of the times when I look at my vocabulary instruction, it comes from two areas. Because of the subject that I teach, one area of my subject, physical geography, the words are quite mechanical and they have a very precise meaning that is almost clinical, and it has to be used in a very precise way. And on the other side, I have words that I use in human geography, which are very gray. So when I use a word like extremely, it's really hard to say, well, this is extreme. How do I ask students to say what's extreme or not extreme? I think that's a really, really tricky thing, and a nuance that I ask students to do all the time when they are in year 11, 12, and 13, because I'm asking them to be evaluative in their writing. So it's really interesting to me how we can ask students to play with these words and how they should be debating it quite explicitly. I thought that we... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Todd.
I was just going to say, and that debate is so important. I know we've spoken about this before on the show, Morgan, but I was a young man who's fairly tuned in, reading lots of books outside of school, and the number of words that even as an adult, one of my former colleagues who did classics at school would constantly correct me on my pronunciation of things like anadiplosis and chiasmus and paralypsis. But even, and I've used this example so she won't mind before, but my wife thought the character in Harry Potter was called Hermione. We don't have on council estates in the Northwest, there aren't a lot of people called Hermione. So she read the book and read a story about a girl called Hermione. I've certainly read countless books as a kid where the vocabulary I understood, but when I went to use it at university, there was an element of embarrassment because I looked around the room and you soon realised that you've pronounced nihilism wrong. So I think actually those oracy moments as well, that they are actually enabling students to have true access and ownership over words that can feel like they're from far off, stuffy university rooms that they don't have access to. So there's actually an element of social mobility within that oracy element, as well as making sure that you understand them. It's about you owning the word in a very true sense. So I think that's so important.
It's really interesting. I remember in high school, we came across the word malapropism, and I remember feeling so empowered by that word, because if I ever messed up pronouncing something, or if I messed up the intention of how a word was used, if I used it incorrectly, I was like, "Oh, I was just trying out a malapropism."
Yeah.
I was going to see if anyone.
Free card.
But it's really interesting. There's a lot to unpack with the social mobility, because words have cachet. Words can get you into rooms. They are really, really powerful. I think that's why the oracy movement has really picked up, and why we see so much happening with oracy frameworks right now, and the importance of having our students speak to each other as opposed to speak through screens to each other is incredibly powerful. But why don't we take a little break? We'll listen to the news, and we'll come back to all things good with words.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads, no distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
As the summer term begins, so does exam season. So The Guardian has chosen to focus on the topic of access arrangements, in particular the idea of extra time. The piece begins with the stark fact that in England alone there are more than 600,000 of the arrangements, and poses the question, how can schools keep up? The aim of access arrangements is to remove barriers and provide a level playing field for all pupils sitting exams such as GCSEs and A-levels, as well as other qualifications. But the article says that the numbers of pupils who now have these arrangements in place has risen significantly. According to exam regulator Ofqual, the number of approved access arrangements was up 12.3% on the previous year in 2023-24 at 625,000, but that pre-pandemic there were only 460,000 arrangements in place. Figures are rising in Scotland and Wales too. The increase may relate to an increase in anxiety and improved identification of pupils with SEND since the pandemic. The article goes on to outline the different types of access arrangements, including the use of smaller rooms, one-to-one invigilation, and the use of scribes or laptops, as well as extra time. According to Ofqual, in 2023-24, 3 in 10 candidates were awarded 25% extra time. The Guardian says it is of particular concern that in private schools the proportion of students with additional time is almost 42%, compared to 26.5% in state secondaries, and it questions whether this is evidence of some schools gaming the system. The article also highlights the additional costs schools face in supporting the arrangements, including extra invigilators at a time when budgets are already tight. Other issues include finding the extra space needed whilst running the rest of the school as normal. One school mentioned in the article said it had told admin staff to work from home for 6 weeks in order to make space. Full details, including comment from Ofqual, JCQ, unions and the Department for Education, can be found in the full article online. Schools Week reports that 79 schools have withdrawn from the Free Breakfast Club trial, with many citing inadequate funding. The Labour government in England announced 750 early adopter primary schools had opened this week, providing 30 minutes of free childcare and a healthy start for about 180,000 children. But Schools Week says 79 schools who were on a published list in February are now not taking part. One Academy Trust CEO said 2 of the Trust schools had withdrawn because it currently isn't financially viable, and that there was a funding gap that was considerable. Other head teachers who made comment in the article gave similar reasons for their withdrawal. The Shadow Schools Minister said the scheme was another chaotic and mismanaged announcement from the Department for Education, but the government said some movement was always expected. Documents about funding for the trial show a one-off £500 set-up payment, a lump sum of £1,099 to cover start-up staffing, and then 60p per pupil per day, with free school meal pupils attracting an extra 78p. Further details and comment can be found on Schools Week online. In Namibia, the BBC reports that new President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah has scrapped university fees from 2026. Addressing lawmakers, Nandi-Ndaitwah said that students would pay no registration or tuition fees at all public universities and technical colleges. However, she did say that there would be no significant extra funding, which raised questions about the feasibility of the scheme. The only contribution as families and students for now will be towards accommodation and other costs, she said. Primary and secondary education is already free in all Namibia's public schools. Further details can be found on the BBC News website at bbcafrica.com. FE Week features a new report on Level 2 apprenticeships, which urges the government to scrap them and replace them with foundation apprenticeships. Professor David Phoenix, Vice-Chancellor of London South Bank University, wrote a policy paper for the Higher Education Policy Institute. In it, he argues that apprenticeships in their current form are encouraging employer investment in higher level skills at the expense of entry levels. He also says evidence suggests that Level 2 apprenticeships have not offered high quality education and training, nor been sufficiently accessible to potential learners. He said the government's decision to introduce foundation apprenticeships, due to launch this autumn, presents the opportunity to address the situation. Changes to the system, he says, would free up funding so it could be used in a more strategic and nuanced approach. Full details and comment on the report, the new apprenticeships themselves and issues around funding can be found in FE online. Finally, the BBC reports that a primary school in Aberdeenshire had to close for a week after a single rat was found. The rat forced 125 pupils to learn from home whilst a deep clean was carried out. The rat was not available for comment. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
And welcome back. We have Todd Brennan and we have Jake Cowling with us to discuss vocabulary instruction and how we can use AI to make it even easier for us to do in our classrooms every single day. And we have so many thoughts about where to take this discussion next because vocabulary really touches upon so much. I wanted to start by just asking about vocabulary and scaffolds. I think one of the things that we find really daunting about vocabulary is the fact that sometimes you have to dive right in and you have to mispronounce a word quite badly. And you need a lot of psychological safety to do that in a classroom. But we also need really great scaffolds. Jake, how do we create those great scaffolds? How do we make it easy? What does that look like for us?
When we say scaffolds, there's many different ways and that we can support students with learning new words. And as I've just rattled off my brain, as you said, their pronunciation. I think that's also important. Breaking apart syllables, syllabification before going into definition of the word. That would be something that I would always take care and consideration, given that my students were ELL learners. So there's ways you can do that. You can start with the second or third syllable, or the third and fourth syllable if there's 4 syllables, and then going backwards. So I don't know if there's a particular name for it, but like breaking the syllables apart and then putting the whole word back together. That would be one scaffold. Most important scaffold, I think, for teachers, if anything, if they're listening to me, to take away, would be to use the word in a sentence starter. So I would say if you're a check for understanding question, they've got it correct, always replying with that check for understanding question with why. And that's easy for teachers because it's only one question every time. Why is that an example of target word, or why is that not an example of target word, for example? And before you get students talking, always say, this is an example of target word because. So give them that sentence starter so they're using the word when they speak with their partners, because obviously the biggest pitfall with turn and talk is it can be quite quick, where the students say, it's an example because this, and this, whereas they actually haven't used the word when speaking about the word itself, which is quite ironic.
That's actually so true. I have seen that so many times, that exact phenomenon. You were quite right.
So, I think that's the biggest takeaway in terms of the scaffold, because oral language is so important. They need to be saying the word and getting those repetitions, right? I think of it like I relate back to my own time as playing basketball, getting repetitions of saying the word over and over and over again. And the only way that we can do that is prompting them or scaffolding them to say the word when beginning to start explaining why the word is an example in this context, or why it isn't an example in that context. I think that's really important. In terms of other types of scaffolds, I think I've also gone down the route of visually, how are you presenting the to be learned information on the screen or on the whiteboard for that matter. I think it's really important about where we put pictures or where we put sentences, where we put in symbols on the screen and how we're presenting that, making sure we're not redundant in the way that we're presenting information, making sure it's clear, making sure it's concise. If it's a check for understanding question and the students need to write down a response, have you got down, a line there for on the screen to prompt them to say, okay, there's a little line on the screen there. That means that I need to write a response now. Because in particular, students sometimes, hear your question, but maybe just need that extra visual as well. So to dual code some understanding of what's going on in the classroom. I think that's something that I've taken care and consideration in as well, because I've got, other pathways of UX design that I've been doing on the side, sort of looking into how the user experience sort of is really important, and thinking about how the students are to visually think about what you're presenting as well, not just verbally. So I thought, okay, how can I best scaffold the lesson or the vocabulary lesson? How can I best essentially slide design? How can I design the slide to be the most comprehensible and the quickest and the most efficient for the student? I think that's an overlooked scaffold as well, I think. Particularly there can be some, I guess, some lethal mutations as well. So, having extra information on the slide that's not really necessary, or that isn't to do with the to be learned information, is something that is often a pitfall when using slides. Or using slides, you use sentences over different, so slide 1, 2, and 3, and you've got information on slide 1, 2, and 3, but it all needs to be together. And so that's another pitfall as well when using PowerPoint slides, for example. It's transient if you've got slide 1's gone and then you're presenting slide 2, but maybe you got the definition on slide 1. Well, that's going to be no help at all to the student. So having the ultimate scaffold visually, but then also having the ultimate scaffold verbally, prompting students to use the word, breaking apart the word, are some maybe 3 scaffolds that I can think of off the top of my head. I'm sure there's plenty more too.
That's
and
really
you've mentioned
interesting.
lots
Yeah.
throughout as well, Jake. Sorry, go on, Morgan.
No, I was just thinking that's completely true. A lot of the times I'm thinking, well, dual coding, we want to make sure that we do have those visual prompts. But you're right, that's actually a place that would be ripe for lethal mutations as well. So that is something really important to keep in mind that I didn't consider. So that's really sage advice.
Yeah, and I was just going to add as well something like that of presenting visuals to students. If you're then going to talk them through, it's about the why of each decision, isn't it? So earlier when you talked about contextualizing and decontextualizing, what the GPT can't do is give that teacher the actual thought process behind it. They have to have that themselves. So using something like the Freya model might be significantly slower than providing a visual image as part of dual coding. But if it helps the students understand the why of that particular image, then arguably that's time well invested.
Yeah,
But yeah,
it's also important about like when do you present the visual to aid that comprehension, right?
exactly.
Because and it's about like what does that picture include? Like especially if you're using AI, I had this this mistake too when it first started coming around that you could sort of prompt engineer to spit out images. The people would have 6 fingers, and then I would show that visual. The kids would just be focusing about, why has that person got 6 fingers? They wouldn't be thinking about the word. So think carefully about, what visual are you presenting, and in what way does it help comprehend, and in what way can it maybe deter, the intrinsic load of what you're actually teaching.
Yeah, and it's really, again, I come back to that thing about decisions, isn't it? Because, yeah, it might be quicker and easier to get an AI image, but where's it going to take the focus? And I've seen, and it's a pitfall that I used to do a lot, was I, as an English teacher, would take the words and turn them into a story, which is immediately contextualizing them. And of course, it's really good fun, and, I would enjoy it, and it's something that I'm pretty good at to come up with on the spot, to come up with kind of a funny story. But what I noticed after 2 or 3 times of doing it would be, the students would then be like, "Oh, I love that story you told us last time about the cruel, like the evil grandma who was really violent." And I was like, no, you're supposed to learn the word hostile and malevolent." and actually all they'd remembered is, "Sir, you told a really good story about a granny that beats people up." And it's like, actually, no, I'm clouding this. I'm actually adding disruption to this. So it can seem like quite a routine approach. I think what you're sharing, someone could mistake it for being routine and too ordered, overly ordered and overly controlled. But it's so that you can get to that next bit of seeing the word in an interesting context, and so that the granny story then is genuinely funny, because a malevolent grandma is quite a different beast to, whatever the children were remembering of my silly stories previously. So no, I think that's a really important point to have made, Jake. Thank you.
Yeah, what takes importance when they're learning that that vocabulary word, right? And things can there's many different things that sort of add to the extraneous load of the students, definitely.
I find it's really interesting because I was in a year 2 classroom a few months ago, and I was watching this amazing English lesson. They were playing with vocabulary, and one of the things that they were doing was exactly that. They were using interesting words in order to kind of create their own stories, but they were using lots and lots of adjectives, but they were choosing them, but they wouldn't necessarily know what they meant. So they might have the word malevolent or evil or ugly or manipulative, all to describe a witch. Now, they might not be able to differentiate any of those words, but they would be able to kind of put them in the broader category of bad because it has to do with a witch, if you know what I mean. So when you're
Mm.
having students play with language, you know that having them explicitly define each of those words is really powerful. How do we go from that kind of playful exposure that tends to happen in younger years, and then we make it very, very explicit as they get older? Is it something that comes with discipline? And by discipline, I mean within subject specific areas. Or is it the way that we build up kind of tier 1, 2, and 3 vocabulary over an entire curriculum? I'm just trying to get an idea of the entire journey, if you know what I mean, as someone who teaches at the secondary end of the school.
Yeah, it's kind of, yeah, because it's all subjective, right? About how you go about those vocabulary words. Because necessarily, so to speak, sometimes I haven't really used the story. It is good what Todd said before, using the story to implement the words as well. But I myself haven't actually used it. So I can't really speak to this. Todd?
Yeah, I think in terms of Morgan, sorry, could you repeat the question a little bit?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how at the beginning, when we are learning language, so much of it is about exposure. And
I got
we are
it.
able to, yeah, so we
Yeah.
can kind of say, well, these words grouped together, I know that generally they're bad, but I wouldn't be able to actually define and really tell you the difference between malevolent or evil or manipulative. They might all be bad and they might even sound alike. So, how do we start to be really explicit? And at what point do we start to branch off and become much, much more explicit and kind of more precise in using our language?
So I think, I'm certainly by no means an expert on this, which is, we've got Jake in the show because he's an expert in a big slice of this, and I'd probably
Sorry,
say that,
I can pertain to that question. I just had to rethink it. It was a lengthy one.
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I do
No.
ask those questions. Sorry.
I was, but yeah, no, I got caught off guard. So no, in terms of like those words, they all have like a a negative connotation or bad meaning. When do we when we do teach them, making them mutually exclusive, I think, is quite important. But then going into the definition itself of the word and really finding out and breaking down the definition for the students into its critical attributes. I think I've read this from Bringing Words to Life or Anita Archer's Explicit Instruction. I can't remember which one, but they say that going into breaking the definition into manageable chunks for the student really helps them give that comprehension to that word, or attain something or put something towards that word that they already know. Breaking it apart into little chunks for each word, and then being able to, going back to the other question, well, scaffold those chunks. For example, I would always use a gesture and always intentionally plan for that gesture for each chunk of the word or the critical attributes. So I would think about, okay, before I plan or teach this word, I would have first I would have the word, then I would have the student friendly definition, but then I would also have the student friendly definition broken down into parts. And those parts is what makes the essence of the word. And so going back to the example I used before, monotonous, if I say it's boring, well, that's not the whole essence of the word. It's boring and repetitive. It needs to have that other part of the word. And that's what makes that word mutually exclusive. So going back to what you said about, they all mean bad, well, then the students actually have to dive into each word itself and what parts of the definition make that word it's the essence of the word. I think that's the most important part and the only way to sort of differentiate between each of those words, right? Because yes, on the surface level, they all mean sort of something bad, but what exactly do they mean? Well, that's when you need to explicitly break down the definition for the students, pair it up with gestures, and so they can retain that knowledge of what makes that word and be able to classify the words when found in context.
I find that so fascinating because I guess pedagogically, I'm not too familiar with like explicit vocabulary instruction the way you are, but I am really familiar with oracy. And with oracy, so much of it, when you take a look at oracy frameworks, they talk about things like if you want to, there's a physicality with using language. So part of that is gesture. So using gesture is really important. The pace of the speech, the tonal variation that you use when you're using those different syllables, and that there's clarity of pronunciation, the facial expression that you use,
Pronunciation.
all of those things. There's a physicality that's part of oracy frameworks that are so important, that allow you to then use those words really effectively. So it's only once you have that down, and so you are actually modeling really, really well, so that those students can then use those words, those talk tactics, which is absolutely incredible. So that actually linked something, and joined up some thinking for me. So yeah, thank you so much for that, Jake. That was really, really useful.
Yeah,
And
I speak about this. Oh, sorry, Todd.
No, I was just going to add on to what you said, which is that I think as well, what we have to remember when we're selecting vocabulary words is that some of those words like evil and malevolent, just to use the examples you've given, they depend upon the stage in which a child's learning them. So for a young person, or in primary school, I suspect that a word like evil, if it's not been encountered previously, is going to need a similar strategy to malevolent to a 12-year-old or an 11-year-old or whatever. However, the frequency of which a child will see the word malevolent versus evil, that's not stage related. That's kind of societal. Unless your dad's a bit weird, like my kids, they've got a bit of a weird dad who uses big words unnecessarily at the dinner table. You're not going to encounter those words, and so the strategy for teaching them is going to be slightly different. You were sort of talking as well, to some extent, about semantic fields and synonyms. It's a language rich with synonyms. And so we do need to understand the nuances, and that's about exposures as well. So some of this comes down to curriculum mapping of vocabulary, which sounds incredibly tedious and probably takes away a lot of people's ideas of what a curriculum and what education is about. But actually, if you feel that these words are important, which presumably is why you're teaching them, you do need to think in those terms as well. So that's just sort of an add-on and an aside from what Jake said, which is very similar to what I would have added as well.
I'll add to that, Todd. I went to Research Ed Dubai on the weekend, and I heard Toby Holland from Step Lab, coaching development lead, talk about explicit vocabulary instruction, and he stated exactly that: curriculum development of words and having the words link from year to year. And I think he used a great example. I think it was there was a Greek unit that linked to like Macbeth within a couple of years, and then being able to have those words link up to different units within English literature. I thought that was quite amazing. So he's gone to that extent, I would say, and so I would say many other teachers as well. Gone to that extent of linking those words up and seeing how, in Greek culture, this is how it was used, but then in terms of Macbeth, this is how it was used as well. So, yeah, no, good point. Very good point.
I've changed schools recently, but if you joined my department last year, I'd been able to give you the 7-year map of vocabulary in the department, which means as a teacher in that department, when you take on a new year 10 group, you know exactly what they did in year 9 and year 8 and which words can build on, hopefully which prerequisites there should be, but also where you're building the existing knowledge and what knowledge is repeated. Even we mapped it out based on that word's very infrequent, but it's really powerful in literature analysis. So teachers, I do think it's probably an overlooked area in terms of curriculum mapping for frequency of words. Morgan, that kind of leads me to something that you've brought up in the past as well about SAT words and words that seem to be privileged in certain curriculums and certain assessments. I certainly recognise that in parts of the English curriculum. Do you want to speak to that a little bit? Because I don't know if Jake, if you've noticed this, but there are certain words in certain curriculums that are strangely privileged.
So I always find this really interesting, that words do have a lot to do with equity. When you take a look at the history of things like the SAT and the way that students would be memorizing words lists for years and years in order to do well in the verbal section of the SAT, there was an incredible study done by Roy Friedel. And he noted that there was persistent evidence that there is unintended cultural and statistical bias that really affected under-resourced, disadvantaged students from equity-seeking communities, and specifically Black students in the US. And what was really fascinating is that what he found in his studies is that Black students consistently scored higher on the more difficult questions on the verbal section of the SATs, and they scored slightly lower on the easier questions. And this apparent contradiction was attributed to the fact that there were cultural differences in language and experience. So common words like snake or horse or rake, they might have different interpretations colloquially in different cultures, so they can easily be misinterpreted on a test. Where there are words like sycophant, for instance, that were much more likely to be related to a school-related text or instruction. They're less used in casual conversation, or they're not culturally specific slang, so they're less ambiguous. They're harder to mess up. And because of that, Friedel suggested for many years that there be an adjusted SAT score that be sent to colleges to help them identify students who are mostly lower income of all races, whose SAT scores suffer because that they just simply don't use language in the same way. And there is still a proposal for adjusted SAT scores for just that reason. It's really, really fascinating because words, they do hold power. And there are words that you find in some canon more than others. So when we are doing things like curriculum mapping our words, and we're trying to make words more, I guess, accessible, and when we look at this new kind of importance that's been given to oracy, I can see how that has massive kind of cultural connotations and socioeconomic connotations as well, or consequences. Yeah. Does that make sense? Did I give you just too much there to digest?
Morgan, it's obviously an area that you know an awful lot about, and I think it probably speaks to why Jake has certainly looked at this and why I looked at this as a head of department. But it's really interesting something you said there, particularly for all of us in these international settings. Jake, you're obviously in an Australian international school. Morgan and I are in British international schools. I remember teaching the English A level a few years ago, and there was references to quite niche moments in Coronation Street. And I just thought, this is ridiculous. No, it wasn't the international version of the A level, but of course, for some students, that was just, I mean, what a strange investment of their time that would have been. And much as you've covered there, for African American students in America, you've probably got things that culturally just aren't pertinent to their lives. In other words, which are extremely pertinent to their lives. And what are they to do? To culturally to ignore their own, or you would have to sort of eschew your own culture, wouldn't you, for future success? Which seems morally wrong, much in the way that learning about Coronation Street in case seems a pretty pointless activity. So no, it's an interesting point to raise, Morgan, and it does raise the question about equity of vocabulary and of culture as well.
Yeah, I think it's the idea of like, well, if I'm going to test kids, am I going to test them on the word regatta? There's going to be a certain class of students that might be more familiar with the term regatta than others. So it's really, really interesting. I think that there's words, and then there's accessibility of words and understanding. So explicit instruction is incredibly important. I think we're just going to have a quick ad break, and then we're going to come to our closing thoughts. So if you guys want to just collect your last thoughts and words of wisdom before we end today's little podcast, and we'll be right back.
Need a smarter way to teach? Wish your lessons had more impact? Eduflix.com. Stream educational films for teachers and students in or out of the classroom. Keep students engaged. No ads. No distractions. Try it free for 30 days at eduflix.com/try. Use code TTR. Get 50% off all orders made before June 1st. Eduflix.com.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out! Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order.
Hello and welcome back. We are just at the end of our show today, and we have been discussing vocabulary instruction and the use of AI to make that a little bit easier. So I thought we'd just go around and have some closing thoughts. I think my closing thoughts are simply ones of thanks, because I feel like I have gotten some really great advice. I feel like I have been remiss and not given vocabulary instruction the time and space that it needs to breathe in my lessons. And I think that there are really great tools that I can use that would be extremely useful, and kind of bringing this to the forefront and actually giving my students those words is really powerful. So spending some more time, I think, to make my tier 3 vocabulary come to life is really a really great reminder for me, and it's definitely resonated. Todd, why don't you use your time to close us off, and then let's get the last words of wisdom from Jake.
Well, I think my words of wisdom, if I've got any, are that I'm absolutely going to go away and have a look at Jake's GPT, his prompts. I'm going to think very carefully about in my new setting how I map out vocabulary, because it's sort of brought to the forefront that I maybe haven't had the time yet to kind of think about that, and each context is very specific. But I think, your point there at the end, Morgan, about vocabulary as a real a point of equity. And I think some teachers perhaps move away from vocabulary instruction because they feel it's too directed. It feels like rote learning. Well, it's the bit that frees you up to do all the bits you also enjoy, because a lot of students in a lot of contexts, not all contexts, but many, they just don't have the words to properly express themselves in academic context. And for me, as someone who's benefited from social mobility and a really good education, this idea that that's somehow a snobby attitude, I'm so glad my teachers didn't take that approach. I'm so glad that they gave me rich vocabulary to be able to go out into the world and access university and then better my family's situation. So when you get, and there are some of them on Twitter, when you get snooty people who are classist in a reverse sense, saying that the working class and that the students who are word poor shouldn't have access to this because it diminishes their culture. I think it works both ways. I think there's an equity issue both ways. And I think your point at the end, Morgan, raised the multitudes of that issue. So I'm certainly going to reflect on that a little bit. You, I think, tend towards teaching me a little bit about the other side of that. But I do think we've covered both ends of the spectrum on that issue of equity there, of one's own culture being valued, but also being given access to words that allow you to access academia and potentially improve one's own setting. So those are my reflections. You might not agree with all of them, but these are our little reflections at the end, aren't they? Jake?
I think that's great, Todd. I'm going to tie my reflection with what we spoke about earlier with oracy and oral language, I always say to my audience at the end of my presentations is that we need to be oral language conscious when teaching new words, and why that is because there's a huge contrast between oral language and written language. That being that oral language has three key features, which is a shared physical environment. So when we speak, when we use give meaning to words, we're using the environment around us. So that classroom, we might use something around us, or when we're on the football oval or wherever it may be, we're bringing meaning to the word with the environment around us. But then second, our body language and gestures, we always use that to give meaning to the words. And then the last thing is our intonation, how we speak and how we use the words, a high pitch, low pitch, whatever it may be. And we need to be intently planning for or thinking about those three key oral language features when teaching vocabulary. These are the ultimate scaffolds, I think, because it's biologically primary. Before humans could speak, we used gesture to communicate. So they're so rich in bringing meaning to words. And you can contrast that with written language. If you're just going to use written language, well, they don't have any of those three features: a shared physical environment, body language and gesture, in intonation. And then to add to written language, you need to be able to decode words. So we need to be oral language conscious when teaching new words. That's probably going to be my little end point there.
Nice. Very good.
Thank you so much, Jake. You've been such an incredible guest. The depth of your knowledge and the precision with which you deploy it, I find it really, really useful because you articulate such specific strategies. I find it very, very useful and thought-provoking. So thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have you. And I hope that everyone has an absolutely amazing weekend. Thank you for listening to the show, and we will talk to you all again soon.
Have a good weekend, both.
Thanks for having me on.